Hello, everyone, and welcome. Let me just check that the microphone and the technology is working as we expect it to. It's not. Welcome, everyone. My name is Steve Rockman. I have two hats. I'm the head of GE Americas. GE stands for the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative. I'm also CEO of Impact ROI, which focuses on sustainability. And I am thrilled to be here to discuss the digital economy and responsible artificial intelligence for rapid development. I was taught by a professor of public speaking that one of the best ways to open a talk is to try and get the sympathy of your audience. And so I'm going to make an overt play to say that first, I must apologize if I do not seem particularly energetic, because I have been talking and thinking about this topic very early this morning. So at 5:30 this morning, I participated on a panel virtually that was going on in Lisbon, a fantastic discussion being led by the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative with the cooperation of the government of Portugal, called the Digital Purpose Summit. And this is a fascinating initiative that is convening 1,000 people from government, from business, from civil society, to talk about these issues, and to talk about how technology can be a driver to meet the global goals, the global sustainability goals, the sustainable development goals, and also the obligations that business has for engaging and delivering digital technology in a responsible way, but also to take the initiative to deliver digital technology in a way that enables development, enables both the opportunity for growth, and also solves some of the major challenges that the SDGs address. And so the timing of this discussion is incredibly rich, incredibly apt. Tomorrow, I will be facilitating a very similar conversation with representatives of the software industry, speaking with members of the United States and also representatives of global governments from around the world to talk about how that industry can drive positive change related to climate change development with its technology. This is the moment for this conversation. And so I am thrilled that we are having it. And I'm thrilled that we are able to have a conversation that addresses something that is absolutely vital that we'll, I hope, hear from the ambassador in a moment, which is that we need to have greater participation from countries and from voices which thus far have not been invited to party on this conversation. And so when we think about the role of Africa, I think we need to think about this conversation not in terms of how we can aid Africa with artificial intelligence, but also how we can help Africa in its own dreams and its own objectives to catalyze innovation, research and development, and related areas. And I think that we have an outstanding set of speakers who are going to be able to help us in this conversation. And I am thrilled to introduce to you first our keynote speaker, Ambassador Ana Zacharias, who is permanent representative of Portugal to the United Nations. Ambassador, would you please share some thoughts?
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for your introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. And greetings to all the people that is here and also to the ones that we have online. Well, I will make basically 3 points. First of all, to say exactly what you've said, that digital technologies, artificial intelligence can be really an enabler for to achieve sustainable development, and we can use it to help countries and institutions to face natural disasters, to bring about models to fight wildfires, droughts, to deal with the climate change and the green transition. And we can also discuss sustainable models for agriculture, for food systems, for public health, for education, for finance, solutions for art, for science. So it is so much that we can do with these new technologies. And we are here to talk also about the cooperation between Europe and Africa. And I would say this is a political endeavor. It's a political question, and that has been growing in importance in recent years. We have the EU joint communication towards a comprehensive strategy with Africa. We have African Union digital transformation strategy for Africa. We have the joint statement of the EU-AU summit that took place last February in Brussels, that brought in again this idea. So we have the political instruments. Now what we need is political will. We need to have political will on both sides to boost its implementation in an integrated approach that works with all African countries, and to make this digital economy and artificial intelligence bring concrete benefits to the populations. And here, as you mentioned, we cannot just work with the easy countries. We need to bring in everybody. We need to bring the fragile, the conflict-affected ones with a genuine inclusiveness into this matter. And the second point in this same line is that we need to make sure that we have the ownership of the countries that are beneficiary of some of these projects and programs to bring about African dreams, African technology, African progress, African ideas. And so the ownership is fundamental. And a last point on this is that we also need to look into the flexible programs and the flexibility of the projects that we're building, because sometimes we need to bring at the same time capacity building, and we need to bring the electricity and the artificial intelligence, all this at the same time. And we have to do it with this short-term perspective, but also with a mid and long-term perspective, and bring infrastructure, bring the knowledge, bring the capacity building, bring the education, all at the same time. So we have to work with a very encompassing vision for these projects to work. Then I can also say that we have already some operational digital cooperation platforms. They already exist. We have this Digital for Development hub, in particular the AU-EU D4D, or Digital for Development Hub. This is a project of around 8.9 million euros, and it aims at the promotion of digital cooperation by providing technical assistance, facilitating capacity building and exchanges of knowledge, organizing dialogues and consultations to support a multi-stakeholder collaboration. My last point would be that our cooperation must be based on shared values and principles, with a coherent human-centric approach, an approach that brings people to the center of the digital transformation. As I said, with local ownership, with mutual beneficial partnerships, with multi-stakeholder involvement, with inclusiveness, and with data security and protection. You were mentioning the event that Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative is organizing today in Lisbon. It all started with a declaration called Digital Democracy with a Purpose. This idea that we need to bring in principles and make sure that the internet and artificial intelligence is fully respect the rights of the individuals and must be trustworthy, and that the systems are used in a transparent, documented, without discriminatory effects, and bring in this capacity to work together in a safe, sustainable environment that promotes peace and human rights. So to finish, I would say that there is a huge opportunity for AI. The AI and digital technologies can bring a lot to African countries, to their development, but we also need not forget, number one, the values, number two, the risks that are involved. We all know what misinformation, disinformation is. We know the terrible scourge that is the hate speech. So we really need to look into what could be a universal regulatory framework that brings us all together without exclusions, not just the big ones, not just the producers of technology, but everybody involved. And that's where the UN comes in. The UN could be the center for this debate, and because we need somehow this like-minded dialogue between Europe and African countries, and to use this global digital cooperation at the UN level that brings an important capacity of working together and brings in rules that could be accepted by all of us without exclusions. So this would be my main points. Thank you.
Sebastian, thank you. You have set us up for a stimulating discussion already. And for as long as you are able to stay with us, we would love to have you continue to participate in the conversation. So thank you for those remarks. I'm clearly sleep deprived because I was incredibly rude by not acknowledging the vision of those who saw the potential for this conversation and put this together, and our hosts at the Africa-Europe Foundation on this, the Africa-Europe Foundation Day with the United Nations, and also thanking our friends here at the Consulate of France for hosting this as well. I would like to turn now to our panel. And what I'd like to do is just to hear your perspectives from each of you on this topic, and we'll go in alphabetical order. So George Chiseri, who is acting manager and director of the acting managing director for the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in Rwanda. George, tell us a little bit about your perspectives on these issues.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to the Africa Foundation and the French Consulate as well for having us. I'll start by excusing myself as well. I'm quite sleep deprived, like Steve. The jet lag is it's been quite real. So I apologize for the low energy, but perspectives of AI. So maybe some background on who we are and why we're part of this conversation. So the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution is a global World Economic Forum initiative. So there's about 20 centers plus, I believe, in the world, across the world. And really, our mandate is to try to identify policy and regulatory gaps that are limiting the adoption of emerging technologies across the world. So really working with governments, innovators, private sector, to identify what are the real concrete practical barriers we're seeing in the space. And how do we together through wider stakeholder groups, diverse stakeholders, how do we identify what those what responses, what answers that we could create to address those gaps. That's sort of like what our centers in general have been doing. In Rwanda, in particular, we're focusing on artificial intelligence and other data-intensive technologies. Again, looking at the policy and regulatory aspects of things. But going forward, we've also identified that we don't see as much innovation happening on the ground as we would like to see in terms of AI. So as a center as well in Rwanda, identifying what role can we play to actually help drive or catalyze innovation in AI in Rwanda. So we've just finished an exercise of identifying what we think are some of the highest potential use cases of AI that could be ready to deploy right now. And right now we're talking to partners and founders to see how we can start creating those innovations. And so that's actually a good segue to what maybe would be my general perspective on this topic. So as Her Excellency just mentioned, there's very many different use cases of AI that are interesting for Rwanda and other developing countries. So as you know, we're severely burdened with key issues such as low yields in agriculture, as an example. AI has significant potential in allowing us to use all the different types of data that's being created, whether from weather type data, satellite imagery, sensors you can put in the soil to read acidity levels, water levels, and so forth. So there's all these data points you can collect right now and build some algorithms on top of that that can really help us be very precise and targeted in how we administer the few resources that we have in agriculture and other sectors as well. And so it's very, very important that we are part of this revolution, that we're part of this movement, and that we're intentionally and actively looking for how these technologies can actually make sense for our economies. And so, of course, like a lot of the groundbreaking innovations are happening in the developing world, developed world, which is great to get to have those examples. But how do you actually make sure that we're not being left behind as well? How do we make sure that we are also building solutions that make sense for us, and we're actually building these solutions from our countries such that they are contextualized enough, and of course our own people are involved in the creation of those to be actually as inclusive and as transformational as they should. So I think the general perspective is there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential for AI and these other emerging technologies, but that's it. There's a lot of challenges as well. And I think we're going to go into a lot of these, but things around, we're just talking about this before, having fundamentals in place. So making sure that organizations, both private and public, are digitized so that where you can actually build things on top of them, making sure that we have the right skills, making sure we have the right regulations in place, making sure that we have the right data sets in place, and very, very importantly as well, commercial models that actually make these technologies actually meaningful. Because right now, of course, some of the conversations we're having is people find these technologies very interesting, but resources are very limited. So you're having a conversation with, I don't know, Minister of Health, for example, hey, can we look at some AI use cases for the health system? Like, okay, it makes sense, but I have few resources that I have to use to buy medicines, I have to use to buy vaccines. So how do you actually also find real practical commercial business models that can actually justify investments into this technology? So I think I didn't have any formal remarks prepared, but I think the general, hopefully that's coming out, the general perspective that there's a lot of opportunity, but there are a lot of challenges as well that we need to address. It's great that we have forums like this where we talk about these topics and hopefully can figure out some answers to go forward.
Well, I'm very upset because if that's you sleep deprived, what does it mean for me? George, thank you so much. I'm fascinated to follow up on a number of thoughts that you've expressed, so thank you for that. Let's turn to Rebecca. Rebecca Disler is strategist for artificial intelligence, data, and digital health with the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you again to the Africa Europe Foundation for hosting us here today, and the Consulate of France as well, and for Excellency Ambassador Zachariah. So I really appreciated your remarks and being part of this conversation today. And I have to say before I jump in, I don't know what you mean with low energy. I think any conversation around artificial intelligence, governance, policy, collaboration, conclusion, in and of itself is an energizing conversation. And I'm just delighted to be here with you and part of it. Perhaps to share some background on our work. I'm with the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. We are a 21st century philanthropic institution that focuses on advancing artificial intelligence and data science for public good and social impact. Quite simply, we believe in a world in which AI can amplify the very best of our humanity, our curiosity, our kindness. We primarily work with civil society and nonprofit organizations all over the world, who all in turn are working in partnership with government and private sector partners. And that global focus is very much grounded in the challenges themselves. My colleagues and our teams work across climate change, education, workforce development, human rights. And of the partners that we work with, and I think quite relevant to the conversation today, the partners we work with across Africa, many are through our global digital health portfolio, which is the work it's such a privilege for me to be part of our organization. And so it's through this lens that I thought I'd share a little bit about the learning journey we've been on as it relates to artificial intelligence and global health. I think that we all know that COVID-19 has very much accelerated the digital transformation of health systems and healthcare around the world. We have seen advances in research and development, drug discovery, in telehealth, in epidemiological surveillance, and in turn, we are seeing the burst of energy, you will, and investment into sort of digital health tools. But I think something that we're very mindful of as an organization, and perhaps the perspective we'll share here today, is that if we want to ensure that advanced technologies, and these are tools, right? These are approaches, artificial intelligence is a tool. If we want to use those to ensure that we can advance more equitable healthcare, and not to undermine or amplify really the inequities that exist in global health today, that it's important that, yes, we invest in the AI solutions and the tools themselves, but as Doris said so well, the fundamentals are important. The underlying enablers of those solutions, the enabling ecosystem or environment. And so, through that, there's really 3 areas that we've been on a learning journey about. The first is thinking about people and people themselves, what we think of as human-centered decision-making. How do we help people, whether it be policymakers down to community health workers, make decisions with or about data and AI? How do we cultivate cultures of data use so that when we introduce digital tools, yes, but also more advanced AI-enabled tools, that folks have that data and digital literacy, but leadership on using those tools. And there's some work that our partners are doing, just to share 1 or 2, or perhaps we can dive into the further conversation, but I'm thinking about our partners at Nexus in Malawi, who are looking at cold chain data and helping ministries of health actually understand that data and then make decisions about where and how vaccines are distributed. There's certainly a foundational pillar around infrastructure. So things like standards, data standards, interoperability, right? How we facilitate the exchange and sharing of data, governance, which my colleague Tracy will speak to in a moment. But I think that are founded in how do we make that data available, accessible, usable. I know when Tracy speak to the excellent work of Dmitry on governance, but just to share that is another example of a partner we work with is Gembi Health that looks at developing open source health information exchange systems and that platform that can really facilitate data across different platforms. And then the third, and I'll come to that, come to the conclusion on here, is really around collaboration. How do we foster that collaboration between AI practitioners, technologists, public health practitioners, public-private sectors, civil society, academia. And I think that as we dig into the conversation today, keeping us grounded that we need to ensure that the tools that we develop are fit for purpose. And that means thinking about policies that can enable the development and encourage the development of fit for purpose tools, and investments in those enablers that ensure that those introduction of the tools will have the impact that we intend them to have. So thank you. I'm looking forward to tackling any number of those topics with these excellent colleagues here.
Rebecca, I just have to echo, this is an incredibly exciting topic and an incredibly exciting moment to be having it. Tracy Lee, Senior Data Lead for D-Tree International. Please share your thoughts.
Thank you, Steve, and also thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation and for the organization. Thank you to the previous speakers for what you have said is already a very highly energetic and stimulating conversation. In case I'm not able to maintain that, my excuse will be I'm coming from a similar time zone. Okay. Briefly, first to my organization. I work for a digital health organization called D-Tree International. We've been implementing digital health programs for nearly 20 years alongside governments, mainly in East African countries. So right now we're active in Zanzibar, in mainland Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia. And given that, I will present the perspective from the implementation level, so the operational technical level, which is sometimes a bit different from the sort of policy level that gets talked about. And this comes from our organization being primarily a health organization rather than a technology or an AI organization. So what that means is that our aim is to use digital technology and AI for the purpose of improving people's health and working towards the goal of ensuring that everyone has access to high quality healthcare. So technology and AI for us are a tool. They're very powerful tools which have a lot of potential, but we recognize that in the end, they are just tools and that they are one part of a bigger complex system, and that you need to put together all parts of the system to achieve the goal of, in our case, improving health for everyone. So as an example, one thing sort of that we think about is that when we talk about AI, this could be a machine learning model. For example, maybe you can predict which babies will die within the first few weeks of life. Even if you could do that perfectly with a perfect AI model, there isn't any health impact unless someone is able to use those predictions and deliver an appropriate intervention. In the countries where we operate, it's often the case, unfortunately, that the medical staff and the facilities required to prevent neonatal death don't exist or are in very short supply. So this alludes to what the Honourable Ambassador said in her opening remarks, which is sometimes you're not just focusing on funding the AI, you're funding the electricity, basic infrastructure, and unless you fund all of the parts, the AI stays as a tool. It doesn't result in the impact that you want it to result in. So the usage of the AI outputs is a priority for us as much as development of the AI itself. Coming on to sort of underlying infrastructure, as Rebecca's mentioned, on top of the topics Rebecca's mentioned, one thing that stands out for us is that there's often investment lacking in underlying data collection systems. So AI requires a lot of data. It also requires high quality data. Just because there is a lot of data available, it doesn't mean it's the right data in order to satisfy your particular use case and to produce a high quality AI model. And also it might not be high quality, reliable data. This is one thing that I think sometimes isn't emphasized enough, that the output of your AI is only as good as the quality of the input data that you use to create it. And then coming on to the other aspects of data, as Rebecca said, data governance is a very high priority for us. So data governance is about how should data be managed, used, and shared in order that it can be as impactful as possible, while still ensuring that everyone's privacy is protected and that no one is a victim of privacy violation or of unintended bias. Therefore, we think a lot about how do you create the appropriate governance frameworks at a country level, or even sometimes at a lower level, such that they satisfy all the requirements, but are still practically implementable given the constraints that you are working in. So sometimes you can come up with policies which are very comprehensive, very sophisticated, but when you come down to looking at whether they can be implemented in practice in the countries you're operating in, you will find some challenges. So it's important to be realistic, not just about what governance frameworks should look like and can look like, but generally, I think my closing remark might be that AI and digital technology have a huge amount of potential, and everyone should be optimistic because these technologies do have the power to have huge impact. But the optimism should be realistic optimism. So it should be optimism taking into account the real constraints and limitations of the countries in which we're trying to operate these solutions. Thank you.
We already have a tremendous amount of food for thought, but unfortunately for our panelists, I have questions. So there's so many places to start, but I'd like to learn a little bit more about your organizations and what you're doing. And so, Doris, if you don't mind if I go back to you, I'm so fascinated by the construct of where you're at, because you're in an organization that's focusing on the fourth industrial revolution, which has been getting a lot of attention in conversation. But it's not necessarily a household concept yet. So I'm curious if you could share with us, take us through a little bit, for those not familiar, what does the fourth industrial revolution really stand for? And how are digital and artificial intelligence part of it? And how are you seeing it develop in Rwanda?
It's a great question. Try to give a simple enough answer to that, I guess. But so what's the fourth industrial revolution? To define that, maybe take a quick historical journey, right? So the first industrial revolution, as I think you all know, started in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And that was really powered by the steam engine, which led to the manufacturing sector as we know it today. That then grew into the second industrial revolution, which is really around moving from simple manufacturing, let's say, to mass production. That was powered by advances or discoveries, let's say, in oil, electric power, and so forth. And so some of the things that materialized in the second industrial revolution were things like the light bulb, telephone, internal combustion engine, which really it facilitated this really mass production movement towards mass production. The third industrial revolution then is, well, I think it's sometimes called the digital revolution. This was when sort of like the internet, the personal computer started appearing in our lives. So the fourth industrial revolution builds on that third industrial revolution, the digital revolution. And it's characterized by a couple of things. One, there's an emergence of this new suite of technologies, super powerful technologies that can really truly transform our lives as we know them. So things like artificial intelligence that we're talking about, things around Internet of Things, so connectedness, blockchain, and so forth. So characterized by this new class of super powerful technologies that can do things that machines or computers weren't able to do before. Second, and very importantly, is you have these emerging technologies that are coming up, and they're really advancing at a super high speed, unlike the previous technology. So I was just reading an article the other day. It's something like, I think it took about 75 years for the first 100 million people to adopt the telephone, as opposed to Instagram got 100 million users in just 2 years. So it's a massive speed, really moving at a really high speed, which makes it very important. The countries like ourselves that are typically left behind are really intentional looking at this technology, so we don't actually get disadvantaged even further. And the last point is that it's the last characteristic of the fourth industrial revolution, and it's a very important one as well, is it's really blurring the lines between our physical worlds and digital worlds and biological worlds, etc. So really this technology is able to make us even more digitally native than we were before, and again really allowing us to use machines or computers to perform tasks that typically they weren't able to perform. So this has been enabled by again improvements in data, for example, in data collection technologies, all this in the developed world, most of that ours are really being enabled by this massive amounts of data we're producing on a daily basis, enabled by significant improvements in computing power as well, which these algorithms, these technologies need to be able to run smoothly. So I think that's really how I would try to characterize the fourth industrial revolution. Of that makes sense. It's really like this convergence of these new technologies that are bringing our digital world and physical worlds together. And so how is it playing, or like how is it rolling out in Rwanda? So the Rwandan government has made many investments to digitize the country. So part of the country's strategy is to become the innovation hub for Africa, concept hub for Africa. So a lot of investments are going into state-of-the-art higher education institutions, but also of course like looking at primary and high school education as well, to really create a new class of highly qualified engineers that can participate in the creation of these new technologies. So a lot of investments have been there. Many investments in innovation hubs to sort of create a vibrant innovation ecosystem, and of course very many investments in the fundamentals like digitization, better data collection, and so forth. So the fourth industrial revolution, technology like artificial intelligence, are the next natural step for Rwanda to be focusing on, in order to be able to really address some of these biggest challenges that we have across many different sectors. And that's it. And of course, this is why part of why the center was established, again, to identify what are those key barriers that we need to unlock in order to be able to actually take advantage of these technologies. It's something that's very top of mind for us, but that's it. Very many challenges again that we need to resolve. Further investments into these enabling technologies or fundamentals that we need to have in place. Very keen on identifying commercial models that make sense. So, it's great that we have many different nonprofits, many different organizations that are playing a role into this, but unfortunately, you don't see as much activity coming up from the private sector community or the innovation community. And of course, that translates into, let's say, not commercial profit seeking models, let's say, which is good that we have folks that are helping us address these challenges in the short term, but in the long term, in order to actually be able to create a sustainable technology innovation system. It's very key to identify, use cases, applications that actually have a commercial sense for our economy. So we're very keen on, again, creating an enabling policy and regulatory environment but also very keen on identifying some real practical things that can actually drive commercial value and, of course, social value as well for Rwanda and the region in general.
One of the things I find fascinating about this point in history, and that I find sort of inspiring about your answer, is that economists tell us that every major revolution, economic revolution, came with tremendous inequality, and that there were those who were early to adopt, to invest and gain capital, who benefited, and it took decades, if not centuries, for others to catch up and for it to equalize. This is clearly happening with the third and the fourth industrial revolutions. But what's, I think, so fascinating, and this conversation is an example of it, is that there's a self-reflection that those other economic moments didn't have, that's democratized. Many people are talking about this. Many people realize that we're in it, and that the revolution itself allows others to participate any way they want to, as long as they have the means to engage in some way, shape, or form. So there's a tremendous opportunity to democratize this and to allow for great participation. And so what you're doing is a great example and inspiration from that area. So thank you for that answer. Rebecca, I want to turn to you. And if you don't mind, I'm going to go a little bit out of the order that we talked about, where I shared before, because I think what I'd like to hear, if you don't mind, is a little bit more about the investment thesis for funders to develop responsible and trustworthy artificial intelligence solutions in Africa, and how you see successful investments, being sought out.
Absolutely. I love this question. And, I have to say, there have been so many conversations over the course of this UNGA around topics we're talking about today: climate change, agriculture, health, digital public infrastructure. And across all of them, we keep coming up against these words: trustworthy, responsible, ethical. And I think something that I'm reminded of in this work is that, particularly, and I'll share, I think, maybe perhaps from the health perspective, what makes our AI trustworthy in a health context is it actually solving a health challenge that needs to be solved? Or is it exacerbating an existing inequity? I think that, like Tracy, I am an optimist in these technologies and the power of these technologies to advance our ambitious goals around universal health coverage, to think through how do we help low resource health systems extend their capacity, extend the work of health workers to reach those who we may not have been able to reach without digitally enabled approaches. But when I think about that investment thesis, if you will, right, it is about how do we ensure, and to bring back to the points I shared earlier, trustworthy AI comes from knowing that something is fit for purpose. And let's bring this home a little bit. How do it is a health worker, if you are, for example, using a risk stratification score, and you have an app on a phone or a mobile device that is telling you that the woman who's sitting in front of you, who is 6 months pregnant, may be at risk of a negative outcome, and the app is telling you that you must then refer her to a primary health clinic or to perhaps the closest clinic. There's so many levels of trust in that. There's the trust that the health worker understands and trusts the output that's being shown on that device. There's the trust that the woman has sitting across from that health worker in saying that you are using the digital tool, and I trust that the tool that you are using, or I trust in our relationship that you're going to give me good care. There's a trust, and I think there has to be when we're talking about referrals in this example, that if that health worker does refer that woman to a higher level of care, that she will be able, as Tracy said, to be able to receive the care once she's there, and that she'll be able to follow up with her. And so I think the investment thesis, yes, it is about the tools and ensuring, I don't want to under-index on the importance of representation in data, representation in the folks that are building this technology. But I also think that trust comes from implementation and building things that are fit for purpose, that are done in concert and in consultation with communities, with users, with those people that we talked about at the beginning. And I think that when we start to think about that, to Tracy's point, that is when that investment thesis starts to shift, not just from the tools themselves, but to the enabling environment. in all of the things that we as funders need to, I think, really engage on to understand the context in which our partners are working or developing solutions, and to support them and meet them on their journeys as they do develop those solutions.
Rebecca, I'm reminded of a study that I participated in that looked at what helped students learn online when they were being taught STEM and building their certification around digital technology. And the strongest factor in determining whether or not students were successful in online learning of these topics was not in the quality of the curriculum or their facility to understand the technology and the complicated science and math, but actually the softer skills. And so I find it fascinating as an analogy that one of the things you're focusing on in terms of the successful AI investment model is really around building trust at its core. And I want to come back to that. But Tracy, let's sort of make this a little bit more concrete for everyone. Can you describe in a little bit more detail the artificial intelligence solution that's been developed by D3 International? And I'll just warn Her Excellency Zacharias that I'm going to put you on the spot right after.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And it's a good time to ask this question because Rebecca has already given a high-level overview of what our AI solution looks like. So thanks to the support from the Belgian Development Agency, Enable, a few years ago, we were able to start thinking about how we can enable community health workers in Zanzibar to deliver more personalized care to the communities they're serving. If you're not familiar with community health workers, these are ordinary members of the public who are trained to deliver basic but very essential health services to their communities. And the power of community health workers is that they're able to reach the thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who otherwise can't or don't access health facilities by visiting these people in their households. However, what happens is that because you're operating on such a large scale, and because these ordinary members of the public, they have no formal medical background, everyone receives pretty much the same package of services. However, in reality, we know that some people, unfortunately, have a higher risk of certain diseases or conditions than others. And so the solution we've developed is to develop an AI model using machine learning, which can identify which individuals are at higher risk of experiencing certain negative outcomes. For example, which pregnant women are likely to experience pregnancy complications in the future. So if we then communicate that result to the community health worker via a smartphone app, which in Zanzibar, all the community health workers have anyway to help guide them through medical protocols and deliver services, those community health workers know they need to prioritize certain clients and deliver special interventions or special visits to them, such as referring to a specialist and so on. So that's the solution that's currently under development. And maybe just to add on as well, based on Rebecca's comment about building trust, we also recognize that this is a very important aspect of the solution. And so alongside developing sort of the technology, we also spend a lot of time engaging with all the stakeholders involved in the program. So it's not just the community health workers who are using it, officials who are overseeing the program, the district health management teams, and also talking to some clients at the end to understand their perspectives of how they feel about a digital tool being used to assess their health.
Tracy, thank you. And I definitely want to come back to this theme of sometimes we arrogantly feel like we have the answers. Why wouldn't people immediately appreciate and adopt it? And yet, time and time again, it doesn't matter where in the world you are or what strata you're dealing with, they don't. And the status quo is very, very powerful. So seeing how we overcome this for constructive means, I think, is something that I'd love to pick your brain about more. But Ambassador, if I can come to you, because there's a theme that I think all four of you have really talked about, and that is this notion of the complex system that we're dealing with, and that we have to work on many things at once. And one of the themes I took from your opening remarks is that there is this sense of urgency to try and solve everything at once. You mentioned energy, technology, infrastructure, education, the technology itself. Is this how should we be thinking about this? Should we have a concerted effort, almost create a full mobilization to deal with everything all at once, or do we need to be more deliberate and focus on a few more important things? How would you attack it?
Well, that is $1 million question. But at the same time, I would say that you mentioned complexity. The world we live in, it's very complex. And for instance, now we just had our UN General Assembly, and there is also this feeling of looming crisis that accumulate climate change. It's the questions of energy, the prices of energy, the prices of food, food systems being in a very difficult moment, and conflict on top of all this. So, and now new technology and the feeling of this revolution that we are living. This brings a lot of questions into people's minds, and people ask, what is this for? And to whom is this being done? And this brings the whole feeling of that we have been talking here about building trust. So we need to look at this as it is. If it's a complex problem, we need to have complex answers. Otherwise, we will be populists. This is a political issue. When we face all these different revolutions that Joris was referring to, each of these revolutions needed political choices from the leaders of the time. And some of these leaders are my age, some a bit older. And we had to experience all this. And so it's very difficult for a leader to say, I'm learning, I don't know, I have to check. I don't have the answer right now, because everybody wants to be seen as, yes, I know everything, I'm going to do this and that. I think the soft capacities that you mentioned, this capacity of looking into things and looking at them and say, this is complex, and I need you all to come to me and discuss this in an inclusive manner. The leaders that will have this capacity will be the leaders of the future, because they will need other people. They will need the scientists. I don't understand. I don't know of a leader who would know all these details. In former times, you would know how the technology would work. The basic technology was easier to understand. This technology is totally transformative. We are in a different dimension. So we need to have the experts with us, bring in the private sector, bring in the legislators, bring in the parliaments, bring in the people to discuss this in a real democratic way, to find complex answers to a complex problem and a complex system that we're in right now.
In listening to you, I think I have the answer, and that is that I think that we need an artificial intelligence solution to figure out how we use artificial intelligence. In the absence of that, we need a more inclusive stakeholder vision and governance and participation. I want to make sure that I am inclusive, and that I invite the panel to assert yourselves and jump in on any of these questions if you have thoughts. In the absence of that, I want to come back to Joris and sort of pick up where the ambassador left off. And so let's sort of concretize how we think about advancing AI type solutions for good, for a commercialized market, for innovation, and how we start creating, as Rebecca was calling earlier, this enabling environment. So what is the process that you see for developing policies and standards for responsible artificial intelligence development in Rwanda?
So the way we've approached it in Rwanda, we started out by putting in place a couple of foundational or fundamental pieces of policy and regulations. So the first thing that we did was help create an AI policy for the country. And so this is basically a set of recommendations, activities that we need to take in multiple different categories to actually really catalyze AI. So we looked at things like what do we need to do as far as skills, for example, what types of skills do we need to be investing in, what do we do about embedding data science or data science type courses in primary school and high school education. We looked at things like what do we need to do around making sure that we have the right data sets in place, what do we need to do around computing power and things of that nature. So we started out by establishing a set of recommendations across key categories that we need to be taking in the country to drive the adoption of AI. And then secondly, we put in place a data protection and privacy law, personal data protection and privacy law for Rwanda. So again, this really governs how personal data is exchanged and used in a safe and secure way. So those are the two foundational pieces of regulations and policies that we put in place. And right now we're working to implement both the AI policy as well as the data protection and privacy law. Beyond those foundational pieces of instruments, the way we go about creating other policies and regulations for AI and data policies in general is we're very keen on having that driven by the innovation community. So we don't just come up with we don't just come up with policies and regulations out of the blue. What we do is we go out to the innovation community and talk and say, hey, what are the biggest challenges that you have right now from a regulatory and policy perspective? We then work to identify the right folks in government, but of course also the right people in the civil society to really bring everyone on the same table and work to identify what the solutions could be. So one practical example that I think Rebecca might talk about a little bit. So the Novartis Foundation has established a health tech hub in Kigali, Rwanda, which is basically an innovation community for digital health solutions. We as a center are embedded in the health tech hub. And so through the startups that are working there, we've identified, for example, that we need to establish a regulation for software as medical devices in Rwanda. So basically how do you give licenses to digital health products. We've identified that for any health tech solutions to be scalable, sustainable, you have to be selling to the public health system. The public health system in Rwanda is like 90% plus of all activity in the health space to be able to sell to them, to sell solutions. But the traditional public procurement processes did not account at all in any way for innovation. So they're typically looking at already established products that are tested in other markets, but how do you also make sure that our local innovators that are working on interesting solutions most of the time allow more contextualized than what you find in America or Europe, and also make sure that these guys can actually be able to sell to the public health system. So that's so we've identified a couple key instruments like that. And of course, once you identify what these gaps are, what these policy regulatory gaps are, we make sure that these innovators are also on the table with the policymakers and government, and we as a center bringing in the let's say the policy expertise to help create these solutions. But that's sort of the approach that we're taking. I think the underlying very, very important point here that you guys are probably already teased out is very, very important to be collaborative in this process, and very important for whatever we do for that to be driven by the actual innovators, the people that are actually creating solutions on the ground, for us to actually make sure that we are creating things that address real issues on the ground, as opposed to just coming up with policies or regulations blindly, so to speak.
So Rebecca, if I could turn to you to build on what Doris was just saying, what do you see as some of the opportunities and bottlenecks in the development of artificial intelligence solutions in Africa?
Absolutely, and I will continue down that slope there. I will continue through the lens of global health, if you will. But just to pick up what George was talking about, and in terms of customer and end user government, I mean, the public health sector is the largest end customer for digital health across that continent. And I think that I'll share, before joining the foundation, I spent time at a small digital identity company that was building solutions that were business to business or business to government. And that is a tricky procurement process to navigate. It's difficult to build those relationships over time. And as Doris was talking, just to reflect on one thing, I was reading through the State of AI report put out by the AI Media Group in South Africa, and they were talking about the kinds of companies that are working on artificial intelligence. This is actually broader than global health. I promise I'll come back to global But they were looking at sort of the organizations that were working across the continent. I think it's somewhere between 200 and 2,000 organizations that they were scanning. And what they were looking at was that they found that the vast majority of them were founded in the last 5 to 10 years. You had 75%, I think, that had less than 100 people on headcount. You had 75% that were privately held. And so you have these smaller organizations that are in need of capital or in need of that kind of pathway to understand, well, how can we demonstrate the art of what is possible with a larger partner like a government organization or a public health system. And so George had talked about the Health Tech Hub, which is a work that our friends at the Novartis Foundation are doing. That's an example of that. To bring it back to, I think, those, so that is the opportunity, right? The extension of the health system. How do we ensure that tools are developed fit for purpose for use in public health systems? That's where the majority of folks do across the continent continue to receive health services. In terms of bottlenecks, I think there's a few, and I'll just name a couple that I think certainly through a global health lens, but are also quite relevant across the conversation. So Tracy alluded to it, but certainly data availability and data quality. I've seen statistics that I think it's like 30% of the world's data is health data, yet how much of that is actually usable by using not just for AI model training, right, to actually make informed decisions around healthcare. Or it's not standardized, it's not available or easily accessible by folks who can turn it into something useful. I think absolutely the workforce investments, and we've started to talk a little bit about this, right? But certainly, and yes, investments in the data science talent that is needed to develop these solutions, but also as we continue to talk about these underlying enablers, the people who then are those end users, people use it, and how do we ensure that they have that data literacy and the data leadership to really be able to use those tools and ensure they have the impact intended. And then there's absolutely policy and governance challenges, and I imagine Tracy will continue to build on this. I think the ones that I'll reflect on are, there's excellent work to develop AI strategies, I think, across the continent. We're starting to see this emerge. There's existing global national digital health strategies that exist in many countries. And I think something we've observed is those digital health strategies don't always extend to include considerations of artificial intelligence. And so there's a need to create a stronger link between those who are working on digitizing health systems and on AI. But some of these policy bottlenecks, so there are ones that come to mind that maybe are maybe not the ones that we just to reflect on, that we've kind of learned and observed with partners who are working across the continent. There are still countries or areas that still have policies around paper record keeping, for example, right? Which means that any digital tool you introduce into that environment, whether that's rather that is policy by law or policy by, let's say, programmatic requirement, any time you introduce a digital tool, let alone AI, you're introducing duplicate work for that health worker, right? If they have to continue to keep a paper-based ledger. I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had around cloud infrastructure. We know that there's a number of partners that are having conversations with ministries of health where, very rightfully so, for considerations of data sovereignty and agency, want solutions that are built on servers in country, right? And there's, I think, important considerations of balancing the security and privacy considerations we're talking about, but recognizing that cloud infrastructure is an underlying enabler of some of these advanced technologies, and how we do that in a way that respects that national sovereignty and addresses those concerns head on. And then the others, and Tracy and I think have alluded to this in the risk stratification, but just to share one more example is the policies around perhaps let's call that differentiated care approach. Something I'm thinking of is conversations we've had around risk stratification for HIV. Right? How do you determine whether, or how can you predict or estimate whether someone will drop out of a treatment program, for example? And if so, once you make that prediction, can you then provide a targeted intervention? Let's say counseling, for example. It's a really, from a data science problem, right? To be able to do that risk stratification, to say, well, we think that these folks may drop out. It's a really important problem to solve. It's a really important health challenge to solve. The challenge is what happens when you introduce that tool into a national HIV program where, based on their strategy, they are already offering counseling services to everyone who's part of that program. What is the differentiated decision that you make with the introduction of that technology? And sometimes that is a what's called the programmatic policy that's in place that may sit outside the purview of artificial intelligence, but we need to be mindful of as we're thinking about how do we foster the kind of collaboration that will create fit for purpose solutions.
So I want to bring it now, Tracy, back to you, just sort of picking up on that last theme that Rebecca was talking about. You alluded earlier in your opening remarks that, you know, maybe AI isn't always a panacea. And I think that very often the conversation about AI is very two-sided. It's either good and will sort of solve and usher in a utopia, or it is evil and will send us all to hell. And we forget about the third leg of the stool, which is that it's actually completely overhyped and doesn't work. And I think all three of those things can be true. And so among other scenarios. And so when we think about the question that you're working on in terms of, you know, what's necessary to help successful solutions scale up, you know, first, you know, I'd be interested in hearing what you think is needed in that regard, but also if you wouldn't mind in this context, sort of thinking about making sure that we're not scaling up the hype and that we're scaling up the substance.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's an excellent summary, I think, of the way the discussion sometimes does go between those three extremes you've highlighted. And the reality is actually somewhere in the middle. And depending on sort of what particular solution you're discussing, it can be more or less towards one of those three pillars that you've described. So in terms of what is needed, maybe first and foremost, based on what you've just mentioned, it's managing expectations. I think although there's a lot of discussion about AI, it doesn't have to be technical, but it needs to be scientifically accurate in the sense that what is possible needs to be clearly communicated to everyone that needs to understand this. So AI can do a lot of things, but it also can't do many things. And when I've said at the start that AI is part of a bigger solution, people also need to understand where AI fits into that bigger solution and appreciate that there are other parts of the solution not related to AI that must interact with the AI solution in order for this entire solution to have the impact that we want it to have. So my first point, I think, is that there does need to be better communication around AI, the potential, but also the limitations and the constraints, and the state of the constraints in many of the countries where these solutions are being piloted. In terms of when we think about how would we scale up, the first thing maybe related to what I've just said is that what often I think isn't emphasized is that there needs to be some kind of evaluation framework that enables everyone to understand and see whether this solution you've piloted does add value. So the question this evaluation framework should answer is, if I compare my AI solution to the next best solution, if there is a next best solution, what is the value I am gaining from using the AI over the alternative solutions? The next thing I've mentioned at the beginning as well is that when you're scaling up, this is when the underlying data system, so for example, the data quality project, you can have more control over data quality. When you're scaling up to maybe a national scale, suddenly you need a lot more investment in order to maintain the quality of the data that you need to produce good quality AI. And then this leads on to, again, coming back to the data governance side of things, which is when you're working at a larger scale, the governance frameworks you need might look very different to the frameworks that are functional on a small scale pilot. And so when we talk about things like in going from a pilot to a large scale, you will have access, you'll need access to more data than you did on the pilot. You will also need to bring in more stakeholders, more technical experts to help you implement the scale up, more government stakeholders to oversee the programs. And you need a governance framework that takes into account all of these factors. And that crucially also needs to very clearly define responsibilities and lines of accountability. And I mention this because accountability is important, not just so that in the case that something goes wrong, the appropriate actions can be taken to minimize the damage and to avoid that happening again, but also accountability enables the public to trust in the AI solution. And if the ambition is to scale AI to a national or greater scale, it is necessary, I think, to have buy-in from the public or anyone who will be affected by or benefiting from this solution. And the final thing is very simple to say, maybe harder to come by, which is that obviously you need resources, financial resources and human resources in order to be able to reach the scale that you want.
Tracy, thank you. And Ambassador, if you don't mind, I want to come back to you. I'm very curious in terms of the role that government should play, and government in the context of both government within particular countries of Africa, the possibility for regions of Africa to collaborate, and then the interaction with the international community. And you know, there's often feelings, you know, there's always debates of where on those levels government should lead, maybe government should follow or support, and where government should stay out. And so if we look at that oversimplified framework, where do you think that the international community working with African governments should lead? Where might they support and follow, or where is better to keep hands off?
Again, this is the $2 million. But this is the debate that is going around in Europe, I would say. It's going around here in the United States, and it's going around also in many other regions of the world. The thing is, how do we bring these debates together? And of course, there is this possibility of the Africa Europe debate. That's the foundation is doing this. This is the moment where we can do this, because we need to find standards. And this debate is between governments, indeed, but it's also bringing in the other stakeholders, the private sector, the civil society, academia, the scientists. They all have to be brought into this debate. And it's very interesting that the Secretary General of the United Nations is bringing this forward with this big program. It's his idea for debating the world we're living in, which is called Our Common Agenda. And in this document, Our Common Agenda, there is a specific block on the digital compact. And this is the place where we could discuss what can we do? What can governments do? Will they be intrusive? Will they be excluded from this debate? Who sets the standards? Who brings the legislation? Who does the regulation? And then it's all about this question of the avoid the internet fragmentation, have people provide ways for people to have options with what to do with their own data. Do I allow my government or a company to use a data? And how do I do that? And what are they using this data for? We just mentioned the importance of the connection between data, quality data, amount of data, and artificial intelligence. So is my data being used for freedom, or is my data being used to control me? This is a very big issue. And this is a citizen's question. And this needs political responses. And the political responses are for politicians, and this is governments. So they will have to come in. And the other issue is this accountability criteria. If something is not well performed, not well done, there has to be some sort of accountability. Who is accountable for in case something wrong happens? Is it a company, a government, we need to establish that. And to establish that, we need to do this evaluation, and we need to bring in people into this debate, otherwise they will not trust the system. So people have to understand the system, and if they understand the system, then they can eventually trust the system. Because we are talking about machine learning, we're talking about things that people do not know and they need to learn. And here again comes the other big thing that is also connected with governments, education, skills. People need to have this debate in schools. That's where everything starts. And that's where young people need to start this debate, this discussion, so that they can do the right choices. And the moment will come to vote. And they will not vote on AI, or they will not vote on this type of things. They will vote on the politicians that will do this or that. So this is very important. So governments will have to be involved. In which way? It's for us all to discuss. And it's very interesting that at this moment, these consultations on the Global Compact are going on. So if you all want to participate and support the Secretary General of the United Nations in having some ideas about what can we do at world level, because this is now affecting every single human being on Earth. We need to come together on this, and the United Nations is probably the best possible place for us to discuss this.
So one of the themes I'm hearing, certainly from you, and I think the rest of the panel, is that this is a complex opportunity, massive potential, massive risks, and requires a scale intervention with all sectors to address. And we're living in a time in which I don't know if Webster's has officially named the new word doom scrolling, or whether it's still a slang, but I'm sure it will become part of the dictionary. And ironically, artificial intelligence is used to advance doom scrolling. So let us fight back against that and return back to sort of the inspirational potential of what we're dealing with here. And what I'd like to do, Rebecca, if I could start with you, and George, go to you, and then Tracy. Rebecca, tell us about some more examples of how AI is being used for health solutions in Africa.
Absolutely, and it's funny because I think the one that immediately jumps to mind when you ask that question is in Rwanda, Babylon Health, and I think it might be one of the more let's say kind of public stories of AI in health. And what has been interesting to observe, I'll say observe from afar, about the work that Babylon Health does in Rwanda is that the initial, this is a company based in the UK that had signed a 10-year agreement. Doris will kind of come here and correct me on topics here. Signed a 10-year agreement with the government of Rwanda around digitizing health services, sort of setting up call centers, setting up national telehealth services. And one of the original, at least again, sort of observing from afar, one of the original intentions of that partnership, artificial intelligence was absolutely thought of and included in that roadmap. But the initial work and the initial partnership, the initial how to improve the art of what was possible, was around digital transformation, right? And around how to digitize these systems. And I think and it's only after sort of setting up some of these structures and scaling this work and doing those impact studies that they said we can now introduce the kind of risk stratification that we've been talking about as part of their product and service offering. And I believe the services that they're offering are now covered by the National Health Insurance Scheme of Rwanda. And I share it as a story because I think that the story that's inherent in there is, it brings us back to those foundations itself, right? How do we think about, when we think about success of any artificial intelligence, right? It comes from what are the health outcomes that this is leading to? And in order for us to get there, we do need to invest in the journey of that enabling environment, in building the underlying infrastructure use case impact assessment that lets us get to a point to introduce that technology so that it can have its health impact. So that's one that comes to mind. The other thing, if I may be so bold, let's think about what success means in this context. I would say that the work that Dimitri is doing is tremendously successful, but it's ongoing. Success is not an end point, right? It is ongoing, meaningful work, commitment to that intentionality that I think Dimitri brings so strongly to the work that they do. And sometimes that success is we have gotten the folks who need to be together in a room around a table. right? And we are now talking about the importance of the data governance model. We are talking about concrete next steps. And I think it's important to recognize those successes when we talk about success of artificial intelligence, because those are the ones that are going to help us create that environment that I think is the adoption of not just the Babylons of the world, but of any of those, I think organizations, the ones that we were talking about earlier, right? The ones that are smaller, less than 100 people, to build that have really good, excellent ideas from the continent for the continent. And I think that we need to think about how we measure success across all of that.
Fantastic. Joyce, let me turn to you and ask, forgive me, I'm going to ask to name your favorite child. But give us the use case that you find to be most inspirational.
That's a tough one. So I mean, if we were talking about a lot of health, so maybe I'll do something else. But I should say actually, because one of the interesting use cases in Rwanda that we're seeing, so this Babylon Health use case is quite interesting, and we're actually doing some work with them as well. We helped them create a ethical guidelines for chatbots for conversational AI. So that's what our approach is. They came to us, they created this AI chatbot, a triage tool. Can you guys help us make sure they have the ethics in place? So that was an interesting one. In health, there's a company that's doing something around AI-enabled diagnostics. So analyzing X-rays, MRIs, CT scans, and detecting anomalies, which is a big help in Rwanda. So for some context, so Rwanda is a population of about 13 million. And we only have 15 radiologists for the whole population. So that's like one radiologist for every million, which is, like in developed countries, it's more like 1,000, if I recall correctly, 1,000 radiologists per million. So we're disadvantaged by a factor of 1,000, which is quite huge. So this innovation is very interesting. But beyond health, we're actually very excited about the agriculture space. So of course, you all know all these food crises that we've all been sort of facing across the world. You also all know that Africa has, fertile lands. Most of our population is involved in agriculture, but yet we're not able to sustain ourselves. And we've seen that there's some interesting innovations in AI that can help address some of these challenges. So we haven't seen a lot of actual AI innovations happen yet in the agriculture space, but we know there's one where we have some enabling digital investments that have already been done in the agriculture space. For example, there's a national central database of all farmers, or not all, but like most farmers in Rwanda, has data about sort of like the things that they're planting in their fields, yields that they're seeing. That's like a lot of rich data sets that we can already use to create some interesting algorithms here. There's a bunch of drone companies in Rwanda right now that you can use for like surveying massive fields, be able to get some interesting data that you can build some models on. There's of course like weather data that we can use, satellite imagery that we can use. So agriculture is one we're very excited about, because some of the pieces around data collection, for example, are already in place. And what we need to do is figure out what are those concrete use cases of AI that we can develop, actually make them real and materialize in people's eyes, like actually understand what these things are. And then very importantly, this is a challenge that we're seeing, but really finding, and I think it was mentioned before, but finding the financial resources, the funding to actually be able to invest in this application. So this issue around funding is one that we're struggling with. We know that there's a few use cases that we can already start to work on like tomorrow, but to find the funding for those has been quite challenging. So hopefully we're able to address some of those issues through platforms like these and others to be able to get some money going to these innovations. And those are some of the few that we're very excited about in Rwanda.
So the most unhappy role for the moderator is to play the role of timekeeper. And unfortunately, even though this conversation is fascinating and we can go on easily for the rest of the evening, I must bring this to a close. I would just like to thank the Africa Europe Foundation for having the vision to put this day and this conversation together. Thank you so much to the Consulate of France for hosting us. And thank you so much to Master Zacharias, to Tracy Lee, to Chrysler, to Joris. Thank you so much for being an incredibly inspirational and informative panel. Please join me in thanking.